Keanu Reeves was not the type of person who often sat down on daytime television shows. He was known as a quiet, private man who chose his words carefully. Whenever he appeared in public, he usually kept the focus on his work, his films, or the simple moments of life that mattered to him. For years, people admired him for being different from the usual Hollywood image. He was polite, humble, and never seemed to chase after the spotlight. That was why it came as a surprise to many fans when it was announced that Keanu would be appearing as a guest on The View. The show, famous for its mix of lively personalities, was not always the calmest place for a quiet conversation. The hosts had their own unique styles. Some liked to ask thoughtful questions, while others leaned into humor or sharp remarks. Joy Behar was especially known for her bold way of speaking. She liked to challenge guests and never shied away from difficult topics. Audiences knew her for her quick wit, but also for her tendency to press harder than others. With Keanu Reeves stepping onto that stage, people wondered how the two very different styles would meet. The studio lights were bright that morning. The live audience buzzed with energy as the opening theme music of the show played. The hosts introduced the segment with excitement, praising Keanu as one of Hollywood's most respected stars. They spoke about his long career, from The Matrix to John Wick, and the remarkable way he had stayed both famous and humble at the same time. When Keanu walked onto the stage, the applause was thunderous. People stood from their seats, cheering for the man who had become almost a legend in the film industry. He smiled, waved modestly, and gave small nods of gratitude to the crowd. His calm presence seemed to fill the room. At first, everything seemed to be going smoothly. The hosts asked him about his new project, and Keanu answered with his usual thoughtful tone. He spoke about the long hours of training for action scenes, how he enjoyed the teamwork of filmmaking, and the way stories could connect with audiences on a deeper level. The crowd listened closely. They admired not just his words, but the way he said them, gentle, measured, as if he truly cared about every sentence. Joy Behar leaned forward, smiling as she prepared her first question. She started with something light, asking Keanu about his preparation for stunts. He chuckled softly, explaining how he had learned martial arts and spent hours practicing choreography. The audience laughed along when he admitted that, despite the action hero image, he still got sore after long days of work. Joy seemed entertained, but then her tone began to shift. Instead of staying with film talk, she moved the conversation toward more personal questions. She asked him about his views on Hollywood culture, about whether he ever felt isolated from the rest of the industry. Keanu, as always, gave honest but careful answers. He admitted that he sometimes felt out of place in the glamorous world, but he found peace in simple things, riding his motorcycle, reading books, and spending quiet time away from cameras. The audience responded warmly to his humility. Yet, the more Joy pushed, the more it became clear that she was steering toward topics that made him less comfortable. Keanu tried to stay relaxed, but his body language revealed subtle signs of unease. He shifted slightly in his chair, his eyes lowered at times, and he paused longer before responding. Still, he never raised his voice or lost his politeness. For him, respect mattered even in the most uncomfortable situations. He believed in answering truthfully but without turning the moment into a battle. That balance, however, was about to be tested in ways the viewers did not expect. The other hosts noticed the change too. One of them tried to lighten the mood by asking about Keanu's favorite behind-the-scenes memory from his latest movie. He smiled and shared a funny story about a stunt that went wrong during rehearsal, which made the audience laugh. For a moment, the tension seemed to ease. But Joy was not ready to let go. She leaned back, folded her arms, and prepared her next line of questioning. The viewers at home could sense something building. Keanu was polite, but his calmness contrasted sharply with Joy's more fiery style. It was like watching two different worlds collide, one built on quiet reflection, the other on bold confrontation. Still, In this first part of the show, Keanu did what he always did, he remained the gentleman. He listened, he responded with thoughtfulness, and he avoided saying anything that could be taken as harsh. The excitement in the studio was mixed with curiosity. People were happy to see Keanu on television, yet they couldn't help but wonder how far the conversation would go. Would he continue to handle the pressure with grace, or would the intensity of the questions eventually push him to the edge? At that moment, no one knew. All they knew was that this was not an ordinary celebrity interview. Something unusual was unfolding before their eyes, and Keanu Reeves, the man known for peace and patience, was in the middle of it. As the cameras kept rolling, the energy in the room grew thicker. The producers backstage exchanged glances, sensing that the segment was beginning to move in an unpredictable direction. The audience, unaware of what was coming, leaned forward in anticipation. Keanu sat there, composed but quietly guarded, as if he felt the storm approaching. For now, though, he stayed in his seat, answering each question with the same dignity that had made him beloved for decades. The beginning of this encounter was more than just an interview. It was the setup for a clash of personalities that no one expected. Keanu Reeves, the calm star who rarely let emotions spill in public, was facing an interviewer known for never backing down. And while the first part of the show still held polite words and laughter, underneath it all, a fiery confrontation was waiting to spark. The early moments of Keanu Reeves' appearance on the show had seemed calm, almost routine. He had spoken about his movies, his training, and the little joys of life. But as the interview moved forward, the tone began to change. Joy Behar, sitting across from him with her familiar sharp smile, was ready to push the conversation into deeper waters. Keanu, though polite as always, could sense that the questions ahead would not be as light-hearted as before. Joy leaned forward, her voice steady but with a curious edge. She asked Keanu whether he ever felt that his humble lifestyle clashed with the glamorous Hollywood world. The question sounded harmless at first, yet there was a firmness in her tone. Keanu thought carefully before responding. He explained that he never felt the need to match the image of luxury often associated with actors. He spoke of how he valued quiet moments, the kind of peace that came from reading a book, taking a long motorcycle ride, or enjoying a cup of coffee without anyone watching. The audience smiled at his simplicity. But Joy was not satisfied. She interrupted, asking why he avoided parties and rarely attended major Hollywood events. Keanu tried to answer, speaking about how he didn't enjoy too much noise or attention. He explained that he wanted to live life as a human being first, not just as a star. Still, his calm answer only seemed to open the door for more pointed remarks. Joy pressed harder, suggesting that maybe he was out of touch with the very industry that had given him his success. The crowd grew quiet. People could feel the weight in her words. Keanu's polite smile faded just a little, but he kept his composure. He nodded gently, acknowledging her point without raising his voice. "I don't think it's about being out of touch," he said softly. "It's about being true to who you are. For me, that means stepping away sometimes. I think it helps me give more of myself when I do return to the work." His answer was sincere, and the audience applauded. Yet Joy leaned back, folding her arms, and gave him a look that suggested she was not convinced. She followed up with another question, this time more direct. She asked if his quiet lifestyle meant he didn't care about speaking out on big issues. It was a question meant to test him, to see if he would take a side on live television. Keanu hesitated. He was known for staying away from political arguments and heated debates. For him, life was about kindness, not division. He took a breath and responded carefully. "I care," he said, his voice calm. "I think kindness and compassion are important, no matter what side of an issue you're on. For me, it's about treating people with respect. That's where I try to place my focus." The audience clapped again, appreciating his balanced words. But Joy was not done. She cut in quickly, saying that being neutral was the same as not caring. The words landed sharply. Keanu's expression shifted for the first time. He blinked slowly, as if weighing how to respond. His voice was still soft, but there was a new firmness in his tone. "I don't think it's neutral," he said. "I think it's about not fighting with each other. I believe in listening, not shouting." The exchange caught everyone's attention. It was no longer the smooth flow of questions and answers. Now, it was a test of patience and values. The other hosts glanced at each other, some smiling awkwardly, others trying to step in with lighter comments. But Joy kept her focus on Keanu. She wasn't raising her voice, but her questions carried a sting. She seemed determined to draw something out of him that he wasn't ready to give. Keanu, for his part, stayed as steady as he could. But it was clear that the tension was building. His polite answers were no longer enough to soften the sharp edge of the conversation. He began to shift slightly in his seat, adjusting his posture, as if grounding himself. His hands rested on his knees, his shoulders straight. He looked directly at Joy, meeting her gaze instead of avoiding it. The audience, sensing the unease, leaned forward. Some people whispered to each other, surprised to see this rare side of Keanu. They were used to his calm, almost shy personality, but now they were seeing him face off against someone who refused to back down. The studio lights seemed hotter, the silence between questions heavier. Joy continued, asking about the roles he chose in his films. She wanted to know why he often played characters who stood outside the system, heroes who worked alone, rebels who didn't follow the crowd. She implied that maybe those roles reflected his real feelings toward the world. Keanu gave a small smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He answered carefully, saying that he chose roles based on the stories, the emotions, and the chance to give something meaningful to audiences. But Joy pushed again. "Or maybe you just don't like being part of the system," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. The audience let out a soft gasp. Keanu looked at her for a long moment. He didn't reply right away. The silence stretched, making the air in the studio even heavier. Finally, he spoke, his words deliberate and calm. "I think being part of something doesn't mean losing yourself," he said. "I think you can belong and still be who you are. That's what I try to do." The audience clapped once more, but the atmosphere had changed. This wasn't just a friendly interview anymore. It was becoming a tug of war between two strong personalities, one quiet and firm, the other bold and unyielding. The energy in the room was electric, and everyone could feel it. The producers behind the scenes exchanged nervous looks. They had seen tense interviews before, but this one felt different. Keanu Reeves, the man who rarely showed frustration in public, was being pressed harder than anyone expected. And though he remained calm, the weight of the moment was clear. The crowd knew they were witnessing something unusual. By this point, Keanu's patience was beginning to show cracks, not in anger, but in the way he held himself. His polite smile had faded completely. His voice, though steady, had a sharper edge now. He was no longer just answering questions, he was defending his choices, his life, and even his character. The audience sat in silence, captivated. Every word, every pause, every glance carried meaning. They knew something was building, though they couldn't yet see where it would lead. What had begun as a simple interview about movies was turning into a public test of who Keanu Reeves truly was when pushed into a corner. And though he still sat in his chair, answering with dignity, everyone could feel that this was only the beginning of a much larger storm. The tension in the studio had been slowly building like a storm on the horizon. Keanu Reeves had handled the pointed questions with patience, giving calm and thoughtful answers. But as the minutes passed, it was clear that Joy Behar wasn't ready to let the conversation settle. She leaned forward, eyes sharp, her voice steady yet pressing. For her, interviews were about testing the guest, about pushing until something real and raw came through. With most celebrities, that worked. But Keanu was not most celebrities. The audience sat still, almost holding their breath as the questions grew sharper. Joy interrupted him again, cutting into one of his answers. Keanu had been explaining how he valued kindness in a world that often felt divided. His words were gentle, meant to remind people of compassion. But before he could finish, Joy interjected with a challenge. "But isn't that just avoiding reality?" she said firmly. "The world isn't always kind. Don't you think it's your responsibility to take a stronger stand?" The words echoed in the studio. Keanu looked at her, his expression unchanged, but there was a flicker in his eyes. He took a moment before responding, as if measuring the weight of her words. "I don't think kindness is avoiding reality," he said, his voice calm but more direct than before. "I think it's one of the most powerful ways to face it." The audience clapped, but Joy didn't join in. Instead, she leaned closer, her voice carrying an edge. "That sounds nice, but some would say it's too safe," she said. "Don't you think people expect more from someone in your position?" Keanu shifted slightly in his chair, straightening his back. His hands rested firmly on his knees now, his body language showing a quiet strength. His voice, though not loud, had a new firmness. "I don't believe in shouting over people," he replied. "I believe in listening. That's how change happens. Not by fighting every moment on television." There was a murmur in the audience. Some nodded in agreement, others leaned forward with curiosity. They could sense that Keanu was no longer just answering questions, he was standing his ground. And Joy, noticing the change, pressed even harder. She interrupted once more, questioning his roles in films. "You play rebels, fighters, men who break rules," she said with a sharp smile. "But here you sit, talking about peace and listening. Isn't that a contradiction?" Keanu's lips curled into a small smile, though it wasn't the same warm smile from earlier. This one carried something else: resolve. He looked straight at her and answered with steady words. "Movies are stories," he said. "They give us a way to explore conflict, pain, and struggle. But life is not a movie. Life is real. And in real life, I believe peace is stronger than violence." The audience broke into applause again, some even cheering. Joy, however, didn't back down. "So you think you can just sit back and be above it all?" she asked, her tone almost accusing. "That doesn't sound very brave to me." This time, the reaction in the audience was different. There were gasps, even a few groans. People were uncomfortable with the sharpness of her remark. Keanu, however, stayed composed. He leaned forward just slightly, his eyes calm but unflinching. "Bravery isn't about shouting the loudest," he said. "It's about holding on to who you are, even when someone tries to take it away." The words hung in the air like a heavy curtain. The studio went silent for a long second, the kind of silence that carried weight. The audience stared, the hosts looked around awkwardly, and Joy met his gaze without flinching. For the first time in the interview, Keanu's voice carried not just calmness, but authority. He wasn't raising his tone, but every word struck with clarity. Another host tried to step in with a lighter question to ease the tension, but Joy waved it off, determined to continue. She asked about his personal losses, hinting at his painful past, something Keanu rarely spoke about publicly. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. They knew his history, the tragedies that had shaped his life. It was a sensitive subject, and everyone knew it. Keanu took a long pause. His jaw tightened slightly, his eyes lowered for a moment. Then, with quiet strength, he looked back up. "Pain is part of life," he said softly. "I don't run from it. But I don't believe in using it as a weapon, or as entertainment. Some things are personal, and they deserve respect." The audience erupted in applause, louder than before. People stood to clap, touched by his honesty. The other hosts nodded in agreement, clearly trying to move the conversation back to safer ground. But Joy, unwilling to surrender, leaned back and smiled tightly. "So you don't want to answer," she said, almost as if declaring victory. Keanu's expression didn't change. He simply met her eyes again and replied, "I already did." The words were simple, but the tone was final. The audience reacted with cheers, the energy in the studio swelling. It was no longer just a conversation, it was a battle of wills, and Keanu Reeves had drawn a line. He wasn't going to let the moment turn into a spectacle at the cost of his dignity. The fiery exchange continued for several more minutes. Joy asked, Keanu answered, but now the dynamic had shifted. He wasn't simply deflecting or trying to stay polite. He was making it clear that he had boundaries. His answers carried weight, his pauses were deliberate, and his gaze never wavered. The audience sided with him, applauding each time he defended his values. At one point, Joy raised her voice slightly, pushing him to say something more controversial. But Keanu didn't bite. Instead, he shook his head slowly and said, "I don't think we need to fight here. Respect doesn't cost anything, and yet it means everything." The crowd applauded once again, even louder. The tension in the room had become electric, but Keanu's calm strength was winning people over. Joy, though still pressing, could see that she wasn't breaking him. Instead, she was revealing a side of him that most had never seen before, a man who could be calm and humble, yet unshakably strong when challenged. By the time the segment neared its end, the atmosphere in the studio was unlike anything the show had seen before. The audience was energized, the hosts were unsettled, and Joy sat quietly for a rare moment, her usual sharp smile fading. Keanu, still composed, leaned back slightly, his body relaxed again, but his presence stronger than ever. It was clear to everyone watching that this was no ordinary interview. It was a clash of two forces, one fiery and unrelenting, the other calm yet immovable. And though the cameras kept rolling, it felt like the real story was unfolding in the unspoken tension, in the gazes held, in the silences that said more than words. The fiery exchange had changed everything. Keanu Reeves had stood his ground, revealing a rare glimpse of firmness behind his usual gentleness. The audience had seen not just an actor, but a man unwilling to compromise his dignity. And while the storm had not yet reached its peak, the rumble of what was to come was undeniable. The studio was tense now, a heavy weight settling over everyone in the room. Keanu Reeves sat quietly, his calm demeanor unchanged, yet the air around him crackled with the intensity of the moment. Joy Behar had continued pressing him, her questions growing sharper, more insistent. She had sensed a crack in his patience, thinking perhaps she could rattle him, but she had underestimated his quiet strength. Keanu had always been known for his gentle nature, his humility, and his kindness, but he also had boundaries, lines that, when crossed, could not be ignored. As the conversation continued, it became clear that Keanu was no longer just answering questions politely. His answers, measured and precise, carried an unmistakable firmness. He had tried to redirect the discussion, to emphasize understanding and compassion, but Joy wasn't letting go. She kept challenging him, questioning his motives, and implying that his kindness was a weakness, that he needed to take a stronger stand. The audience could sense the change in energy. Earlier, the tension had been subtle, almost polite. Now, it was almost tangible, a storm waiting to break. The other hosts tried to intervene, to lighten the mood, but Joy pressed forward, relentless in her approach. Her words were sharp, aimed to provoke a reaction, and the audience was silent, watching, waiting to see what Keanu would do next. Keanu took a deep breath. He had remained calm for as long as he could, answering questions thoughtfully, maintaining his composure. But the repeated interruptions, the relentless questioning, and the constant challenge to his values had begun to take their toll. He wasn't angry in the usual sense, but he was firm, resolute, and increasingly aware that this conversation had crossed a line. There was a limit to patience, even for someone as composed as him. Joy leaned forward once more, her tone almost accusatory. "You say you want peace," she said, "but don't you think sometimes people need to take a stand, even if it means anger or confrontation?" Keanu looked at her, his eyes steady and unwavering. The calmness in his gaze was intense, almost magnetic. He had answered questions like this before, always with care, but now his voice carried a quiet authority. "I take a stand every day," he said slowly. "But I do it with integrity. I do it with respect. I don't believe in shouting over people or letting anger control my actions." The audience reacted with a mixture of applause and murmurs. Some admired his composure, while others were captivated by the tension building on stage. Joy, sensing that her words were not having the desired effect, pressed further. "But isn't it frustrating sometimes?" she asked. "Don't you ever feel like the world is unfair, and that you have to fight back, no matter what?" Keanu paused. His hands rested lightly on his lap, his body still, yet the strength in his presence was undeniable. "Of course I feel frustrated," he said. "Of course I see the unfairness in the world. But fighting doesn't always mean raising your voice. Fighting doesn't always mean anger. Sometimes the strongest stand you can take is to remain true to who you are, even when others try to push you into conflict." The tension in the studio was now almost unbearable. The audience leaned forward, silent, hanging on every word. The other hosts exchanged nervous glances, aware that the situation was teetering on the edge of a breaking point. Joy, however, was relentless. She smiled tightly, her next question designed to provoke, to test the limits of his patience. "You say you're calm and collected," she said, "but isn't there a part of you that just wants to say something, do something dramatic? Don't you ever get tired of being polite?" Keanu's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in a moment of deep clarity. He had listened patiently, explained himself repeatedly, and maintained his composure despite provocation. But now, he realized that the conversation had reached a point where continuing would serve no purpose. His words, no matter how carefully chosen, were being twisted, challenged, and undermined. He had given respect, honesty, and patience, and it had not been returned. For a long moment, he simply looked at Joy, and the studio fell silent. The audience held its breath. Even the production crew seemed to pause, sensing the tension thickening in the air. And then, with quiet resolve, Keanu made a decision. "I think this conversation has gone as far as it can," he said softly but firmly. His voice carried a calm authority that left no room for argument. "I've shared my thoughts, my experiences, and my beliefs. I respect this platform, and I respect everyone here, but I also have to respect myself." He stood slowly, his movements deliberate and composed. The audience gasped, some in surprise, some in admiration. Keanu's gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of the hosts, the cameras, and the crowd. There was no anger in his expression, no bitterness, only a quiet strength and unwavering dignity. Joy opened her mouth, perhaps to respond, but the words caught in her throat. Keanu had not raised his voice, had not shouted or stormed aggressively. Yet the impact of his presence, his decision to leave, was undeniable. It was a powerful statement, more commanding than any words could have been. He walked slowly toward the exit, his steps measured and calm. The studio was silent, the audience unsure whether to cheer or remain stunned. The other hosts looked on, some with concern, some with admiration, as Keanu passed them with grace. His actions spoke louder than any argument could. He was asserting his boundaries, showing that respect could not be demanded through provocation. As he reached the door, he paused briefly, looking back once. There was a quiet, almost gentle look in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement to the audience, to the hosts, to anyone watching at home. It was as if he was saying, "I came here with respect. I leave with dignity." And then, without a word, he walked out of the studio. The silence that followed was deafening. The audience was in shock, the hosts momentarily speechless. Cameras continued to roll, capturing the empty space where Keanu had stood moments before. The energy in the room was electric, a mixture of astonishment, admiration, and disbelief. People had witnessed something rare, a man standing firmly for his principles without resorting to aggression, raising his voice, or compromising his character. Producers whispered to one another, trying to figure out what had just happened. Social media feeds would soon explode with reactions, clips, and commentary. But in that moment, nothing mattered except the statement Keanu had made through his actions. He had shown that dignity, self-respect, and calm authority could be more powerful than confrontation, more impactful than any debate. Joy Behar, usually quick with a sharp retort or a playful jab, remained quiet. She leaned back in her chair, processing what had just unfolded. The audience slowly began to applaud, first tentatively, then with growing enthusiasm. People stood, clapped, and cheered, not for the drama, but for the principle, for the courage it took to walk away while remaining composed and respectful. The other hosts tried to salvage the segment, to comment, to transition to another topic, but the moment had passed. Keanu's decision had created a shift, a ripple effect that would be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. The energy in the studio had changed irreversibly, leaving behind a lesson about patience, integrity, and the power of standing firm without resorting to anger. Outside the studio, Keanu walked calmly through the corridor, away from the bright lights and the intense scrutiny. He didn't rush, didn't look back with regret or resentment. His mind was clear, his conscience at peace. He had chosen to protect his values, to maintain his dignity, and to demonstrate that respect and strength could coexist without hostility. The incident would soon become a talking point everywhere. News outlets would cover the showdown, social media would buzz with opinions, and fans would analyze every detail. But for Keanu, it wasn't about the spectacle or the headlines. It was about staying true to himself, about showing that even in moments of extreme pressure, one could act with integrity, calmness, and quiet authority. By the time the segment ended, the studio was a mix of stunned silence and reflective applause. People were still talking, whispering to one another about what they had just witnessed. They had seen a rare display of composure in the face of relentless questioning. They had seen a man who, despite the provocation, maintained his principles and chose to walk away with dignity rather than escalate the conflict. And in that moment, Keanu Reeves had not just left a television studio. He had left a mark, a lesson in self-respect, patience, and the power of calm authority. His departure was not just a physical exit but a statement of who he was, what he stood for, and how he expected to be treated. The moment Keanu Reeves left the studio, a quiet shock hung in the air. The audience sat frozen for a few seconds, processing what had just happened. There was no shouting, no explosive argument, just the calm exit of a man who had chosen dignity over drama. Some people in the crowd started whispering to each other, trying to make sense of the scene they had witnessed. Others sat in complete silence, staring at the empty space where he had just stood. Cameras continued to roll, capturing the stunned reactions of the hosts and the production team. Everyone in the studio knew they had just been part of something unusual, something that would be talked about for a long time. The other hosts tried to continue the show, but it was clear that the energy had shifted. The tension that had filled the room was replaced with a sense of reflection. They tried to comment on the segment, to explain what had happened, but the words felt hollow. Nothing they said could capture the impact of Keanu's exit or the quiet strength he had shown. The production team behind the scenes whispered among themselves, realizing that this was a moment that would be replayed over and over on news channels, social media, and entertainment programs. As soon as the broadcast ended, social media erupted. Clips of Keanu's calm, firm exit were shared widely. Fans praised him for maintaining his composure and for showing that one could take a stand without resorting to anger or harsh words. Memes and posts began circulating, highlighting his quiet dignity and his decision to walk away instead of engaging in conflict. People everywhere were debating the incident, some defending Joy Behar's questions, others applauding Keanu for staying true to his values. The story quickly became a trending topic. News outlets ran segments analyzing the event, replaying clips, and discussing the interaction between Keanu and Joy. Talk shows and online forums debated what had happened, why Keanu chose to leave, and what it said about his character. Every clip of him standing, looking calm but resolute, and then walking out was dissected and celebrated. Journalists noted that it was rare to see such a composed reaction in a heated moment, especially on live television. Fans of Keanu Reeves were particularly vocal. They flooded social media with messages of support, praising him for showing courage and self-respect. Many people shared personal stories about times when they had to stand up for themselves without losing their temper, connecting with the way Keanu handled the situation. They admired how he managed to convey strength without aggression, showing that one could maintain kindness and humility even under pressure. Some commentators pointed out that Keanu's behavior reflected the qualities that had made him beloved worldwide. He had always been known for his humility, generosity, and thoughtfulness. But this incident highlighted another side of him, his strength, his awareness of personal boundaries, and his ability to act decisively when a situation demanded it. It was a reminder that being kind and respectful did not mean being weak, and that integrity could be more powerful than confrontation. Meanwhile, in the studio, the production team reviewed the footage. They realized that the segment, despite its unexpected ending, would generate enormous attention. Some were concerned about how the audience might react, but others understood that this was a moment that would resonate deeply with viewers. It was an example of how live television could produce unscripted, unforgettable moments that went beyond entertainment, touching on human values and personal principles. Backstage, some of the crew shared their perspectives. They spoke about how unusual it was to witness a celebrity of Keanu's stature handle a tense situation with such calm authority. One producer remarked that most people, when confronted with persistent provocation, might have reacted defensively or angrily. But Keanu had chosen a different path, one of quiet strength and unwavering self-respect. His actions reminded everyone present that power did not always come from raising your voice, sometimes it came from knowing when to walk away. News of the incident spread internationally. Media outlets from different countries reported on it, analyzing both the confrontation and Keanu's response. Articles highlighted the lesson embedded in the moment, that personal boundaries and self-respect were worth protecting, even in high-pressure situations. Interviews with fans and viewers showed that people were inspired by the way Keanu had handled the situation, seeing him not just as a movie star, but as a role model for integrity and calm leadership. The conversation around the incident quickly evolved. Many people began discussing the importance of respectful dialogue, both on television and in everyday life. Keanu's decision to leave the studio became an example of setting boundaries without resorting to conflict. Experts on communication and conflict resolution praised his approach, noting that remaining calm while asserting oneself was a powerful tool that many people struggled to master. The incident sparked discussions about how to handle provocation, how to maintain composure under pressure, and how respect could be more effective than aggression in resolving disagreements. Fans and celebrities alike shared their admiration online. Some actors, colleagues, and friends of Keanu expressed their support, noting that his behavior reflected the values he had consistently demonstrated throughout his career. They highlighted how unusual it was for someone to act with such patience and grace, especially in the spotlight. Many people pointed out that the moment was a reminder that true strength often lay in restraint and that choosing dignity over conflict could leave a lasting impact. Meanwhile, Joy Behar and the other hosts reflected on the segment. They acknowledged that the interaction had become more intense than expected and that Keanu's exit had left a powerful impression. While some viewers debated the nature of the confrontation, most agreed that Keanu had handled the situation with integrity. The hosts recognized that his calm authority and clear boundaries had shifted the focus from a typical heated exchange to a lesson in personal dignity and self-respect. As days passed, the incident continued to make headlines. Clips from the segment were replayed on news channels, shared widely on social media, and discussed on various talk shows. People everywhere analyzed Keanu's behavior, admiring the quiet confidence and poise he had displayed. His exit from the studio became symbolic of how one could handle conflict gracefully, showing strength without anger, and standing firm without confrontation. The long-term impact of the moment was evident in how it resonated with people personally. Many fans shared that it inspired them to reflect on their own lives and relationships. They spoke about situations where they had faced provocation or pressure and realized that they could respond with calm authority rather than anger. Keanu's example encouraged people to value their integrity, maintain patience, and respect themselves even when others challenged them. Even in Hollywood, the incident was discussed as a rare example of a celebrity standing firm without losing composure. Agents, directors, and fellow actors noted that Keanu had managed to handle a high-pressure, live television situation with elegance and strength. The fact that he walked away quietly, without drama, only increased admiration for him. It was seen as a testament to his character, showing that he could command respect simply through his presence and the choices he made. The studio itself eventually shared a statement, acknowledging that the conversation had become intense and that Keanu's exit had been a reflection of his principles and personal boundaries. They praised him for his professionalism and for demonstrating that even in difficult moments, one could act with respect and integrity. The statement further fueled public discussion, reinforcing the idea that maintaining composure and dignity was a powerful way to handle challenges. Weeks later, the incident remained a topic of discussion, not just because of the drama, but because of the lesson it had taught. Keanu's actions were cited in articles about conflict resolution, in interviews about leadership, and even in motivational talks. People referred to the moment as a rare example of how calm authority, integrity, and self-respect could make a stronger statement than anger or confrontation ever could. In the end, the showdown at The View became more than a segment on television. It became a symbol of patience, dignity, and the power of quiet strength. Keanu Reeves had walked away, but in doing so, he left behind a lasting impression that went far beyond the studio. His decision reminded everyone that maintaining integrity, setting boundaries, and acting with calm authority were choices that could inspire admiration, respect, and reflection. For viewers, fans, and even casual observers, the lesson was clear: true strength was not measured by how loud one could be, how aggressively one could argue, or how forcefully one could respond. True strength, as Keanu had shown, came from knowing one's values, standing by them with dignity, and choosing one's actions thoughtfully. His walkout was not an act of defiance or anger, it was an act of clarity, respect, and self-awareness. The story of that day would be remembered for years to come, replayed in clips, shared in articles, and discussed in conversations. Keanu Reeves had not only demonstrated personal integrity, but he had also offered a subtle, powerful lesson in human behavior. He had shown that calm, thoughtful action could be more effective and memorable than confrontation, and that walking away with dignity was often the most powerful statement of all.